So I think in that case, we can already start. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming here today. Thanks very much for choosing this workshop amongst the other 2 workshops that we're running at the same time in the parallel sessions. Just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Raquel de Luis. I am a senior consultant at Ipsos. Ipsos is a company that is headquartered in Paris, but has offices all around the world, has offices in over 80 countries, and it's present in most of the European countries. So it's mostly based everywhere in the EU. Steve and I are based in the office in London. You may have heard of Ipsos before. It's basically a consultancy firm. It's specialized in 2 main areas. One is work for public clients, and another main area is work for private clients. So it has a lot of market research. In terms of working for public clients, Ipsos is very well known for pollings and for surveys. And we have started around 10 years ago working on evaluation, and it's something that it's kind of growing a lot in the company. And something that really, I would say, characterizes Ipsos as regards other consulting firms is that as it has this part of market research where normally, you know, private companies are much more keen to explore new methods of research. So our colleagues in the market research area have started testing new methods on neuroscience, new ways to carry out surveys, new ways to using big data in their own research studies. And we are kind of building on this research that they have been conducting and using that for our evaluations. But before entering into the matter, I want to leave some space to my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Thank you. So just to say, I'm Steve Guinness. I'm a research director sitting in a essentially like a public affairs social research team. So I've been doing research for about 10 years or so, and over maybe the last 5 years I've been responsible for looking after our more innovative methods, so trying to make sense of social media as one, but as Raquel mentioned, neuroscience, big data, text analytics, mobile tracking data. And essentially I think what's helpful for us, it's interesting to build on the comments from this morning, we are not data science specialists at all. And so what we are, hopefully, is we're just researchers and evaluators trying to answer research and evaluation questions as best we can, making the use of the widest range of possible data. So we're coming at this very much from a kind of client perspective as well, really, as is social media useful for my project? What are the different ways in which we can use it? And what are some of the opportunities and limitations? So just so you can understand where we're coming from, we're not technology-based, we're research-based. But yeah, and Dr. Jun.
Okay, so my name is Jun. I'm actually from this university in Luxembourg. I'm not belong to this company, Ipsos. My background is computer science. I actually doing applied research on social media data. So I analyze a lot of like Instagram data. I mainly focus on this kind of security and privacy issues, and also proposing method how to protect the privacy in this kind of social medias. I will give you more details later. Thank you.
Okay, so the aim of the session today is, as Steve said, we are mainly researchers and evaluators, so it's a bit demystifying, no? All this use of big data, how can we use it, but we are not data scientists. Okay, but you know, even though we are not mathematicians or scientists, there are some tools that can help us gather and analyze this data. So the aim of the session is more or less to give you some tools that you can use in your evaluations, or if you are looking forward to commission an evaluation, to give you a bit of knowledge of what it means to actually gather data from social media. So we will explore first the opportunities, challenges, and limitations. We want to make this session quite interactive, so we will ask you at some points, you know, some general questions to discuss among yourselves, and then to feedback to to the whole room, you know, so that we can see as well what are you expecting from this session, and we can try to answer all your questions here. After discussing opportunities, challenges, and limitations, which has already been discussed a lot as well during the morning, we will present some real examples of projects. I will be presenting on a couple of examples where we have used it actually for evaluations. Dr. Jun is also going to explain how he's using data from Instagram, and also Steve will present some more examples where we have recently used it at Ipsos. Then we will have a small exercise where we will ask you to build a query. This will mean we will show you how you can really download data from platforms. And then finally, we will touch on some ethical considerations that we really need to be aware of when conducting this kind of research. So before we move forwards, can I ask how many of you to please just raise your hands if you have used social media in evaluations or research studies? Okay, good. We have a couple of people who have already done it. And who of you are keen to explore these methods? Who are looking forward to perhaps using it in the future or commissioning research? Can you raise your hands as well? Okay, quite a few people. That's good. Good. Okay, so as I was saying, we want to do this an interactive discussion. So the first thing that we want to ask you is whether you could introduce to each other, to the people you are sitting next to, perhaps discuss within your own tables. You can introduce yourselves to each other. And then there are some questions that we would like you to talk about. The first one is, what does social intelligence mean to do? Because this social intelligence is a term that perhaps it's not so clear. So what does it actually mean for you? Second is, how can it help my evaluation? This would mean what are the opportunities for using social media, and how perhaps triangulating with other methods, how it can bring some new insights into the evaluations. The third question is something that, as I was saying, has been largely discussed this morning. What are the barriers and challenges of using social media data in evaluations? And the fourth is, we want you to tell us what are your questions, like what are you really expecting from these workshops, so that you know, we can try to answer your questions. So please go ahead and discuss within your peers.
Okay, everyone, just to say, just another minute in your tables and then we'll come back together. So just close up your remarks. You've got another minute to chat.
Okay. Is that okay? Everyone has already more or less discussed the topics, or do you need some more time? It's okay? Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to write down here the main aspects that you think, so that we have it here and we see during the presentation whether we are covering the different elements that you raised now. So the first question is, what does social intelligence mean to you? Can someone just volunteer and say what is social intelligence for you? Otherwise, I will pick up someone. Be careful. Or those who have already, yeah, please.
So, again, I don't want to sound odd, but for me, it is just an illusion.
An illusion, why?
Because it's a fact. People, they can fake it. People, they can actually manipulate it. People, they can get a different perspective in their persona. So social intelligence, it's almost an illusion.
An illusion, okay. Any other, yes, please?
For me, it's what we call many often the perception of people about something.
Okay.
How they perceive it, how they think about it, and how they express it.
Mm-hmm.
Life is an illusion anyway.
But the different, I think, in a social or internet, you can have a different persona, and that makes it more difficult to create a different illusion. And in a physical life, you can be and create your own illusion, yes, face to face, or in a media. But now you make it yourself, is more exposed to have a different persona.
Yeah. See, yes.
It also helps you map networks.
Sorry, say again?
It could map the network.
Yes, indeed.
And that's interesting to know who dealt with that
Mm-hmm.
and in which manner.
Yeah.
It's a map.
So,
We are all, some of them, some of us are users
of social media.
And when I am a user of Facebook, for example, it's not exactly similar to my own using of LinkedIn, for example. So behind one persona or one guy, one lady, one man, maybe there are a number of actors.
Yeah. Okay, so what I am seeing here is that perhaps one limitation of using data from social media is that people might think something different to what they are expressing online, no? Is this the main idea, perhaps? Yeah. Dangerous, why? Okay.
Play a role without using any social media.
Yeah, but this opens, much more the things. Yeah, exactly. In the old times, it was to my neighbor. Nowadays, I can, take
Yeah, yeah, of course. So before we continue discussing about this limitation, I'm going to explain that for us, social intelligence is this research tool that we can use to gather and to analyze data that comes from not just social media, but also from blogs or any kind of information online. Yes, Steve, do you want to say something?
Is it easier for me to write while you...
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
perfect, thank you. And I think there was someone who wanted to intervene.
I'm impressed by the definition that you gave, that intelligence produces this processing capacity of the things that we are doing, data from social media. I believe that in a general definition of social intelligence to me, it's the, let's call it the perception or awareness of a person in the social environment, right? And all the things that has to do with that, the interactions, the understanding, and so on.
Yeah.
And the position of a person in the social environment.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. It's kind of a wider concept than just bringing it to a research tool that we can use. And in terms of the opportunities that it can bring, have you had the time to think of perhaps any ways in which it can help evaluations? Yes, sir.
I can talk for experience. One use case that we have is evaluating the activity of countries and companies towards the United Nations SDGs. Something we developed at the moment. And by using keywords from the definition of the SDGs and also some of the indicators, we try to see what is the activity, what the companies and corporations do, what people think about what companies and corporations do, and stuff like that.
Good.
I'm not
Yeah.
an evaluation expert, I'm a data scientist, but
Yeah, no, indeed. Yeah, indeed, that is one of the uses that we are making of social media. Yes, please go ahead.
Another use is also to reach beneficiaries that you couldn't reach in a normal way. You don't have at your disposal, for example, email addresses. It's a powerful tool to identify them. For example,
Yeah.
beneficiaries of a policy or program in Europe, for example, in the European Social Fund. So it would be interesting idea to complement your sample or your list of addresses with
Yeah.
data.
Yes, indeed, totally. Yeah. Any other ideas on ways in which it can help evaluations? Yes.
So we have this idea, but it's just an idea of an opportunity for even big or small infrastructure projects. If you can do some kind of sentiment analysis for satisfaction or with the service or aspects that could be improved. I know that it's quite close to market research, but if you're financing infrastructure and you're interested in the feelings of the final beneficiaries, I imagine that it's done and it could also be done.
Yes, yes, you will see that this is actually one of the elements that in which we have used it as well. So yeah.
I'm not sure about the definition that you're going to give to us, but for me, evaluation could be like the quality of life in different aspects. It can be like socioeconomic impact, improvement of daily individual lives, and so on. Understanding aspects of life and trying to improve could be like a way to evaluate an analysis or have some intelligence in terms of going towards an improvement of the qualities of life. That could be like a way to go.
Let's see if I am understanding correctly. So you phrase it as a way to understand what are perhaps the main problems that a society has by looking at their activity? Or what is their sentiment in general?
It could be an aspect of the analysis.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a very broad domain.
yeah,
Do you need a better definition of that?
yeah. You wanted to say something?
I was just going to say, should we move?
Yes, we can move forwards. In terms of challenges, you have already said this limitation of kind of fake personalities of people trying to imitate others, etc. Any other barriers or challenges for you, for example, to use social media?
Really wondering about different cultural contexts because of several languages, several cultures in the same country.
Totally, yeah.
To think that the way we measure something, like what we were saying about satisfaction in these things, are already old, let's say, because it's the tools
And do you see this more as a limitation or as an opportunity to use social media? This aspect that you are commenting of analyzing behavior through.
Now it's a limitation because of the tools, but I think it's the future. It will have AI in order exactly to study these kind of things. Not people really not knowing or participating directly, but being observed.
Okay. Yes?
For me, a major issue is the representativeness.
Okay. Yes. It's not like a survey.
Online or are active in social media represent specific group of society, like teenagers, young adults, professionals, people, white collar, and there are big parts of society that are missing.
Yes.
Like older people, which is now, I don't know, 1/4 of our community. People that don't share technological skills. I would say for the developed world, everybody has access to internet, but in the developing world, nobody has access to the internet.
Yes. Yes. Totally.
So it can be that even with the best algorithm or with the best methodology, you can get robust results, but this could be a priori bias just because of this misrepresentation problem. So I think it can perform very good in specific jobs, but for others we still need to have a little bit of more traditional
Yes. Yes. Indeed. Yeah. This is one of the characteristics.
and that goes back to the previous question, is that people they are fed up with surveys. They stop responding. So inevitably, we would go this way just because people don't want to answer to surveys. They're tired. They're bombarding every day by consultants, by companies, by marketers. They don't want it.
Yeah.
It's one thing, and the other thing is that we see over time that this technology performs equally with other more traditional methods.
Yes. Yes.
Then, if the sample is big enough, we come to the same conclusion.
Okay. And in terms of the kind of questions that you have and that perhaps you would like us to answer, is there any specific question that you would like to raise at this moment? And I can't promise that we will answer it, but we will make our best. Okay. No specific questions? Okay, so perhaps we can move forward? Yeah.
That's pretty good. The first half of the workshop, you've basically done a whole presentation within 15 minutes, but we see a lot of the same opportunities and challenges. Thank you.
Yes, so exactly as Steve was saying now, we are going to present very quickly the opportunities, challenges, and limitations that we had identified on the use of social media. Some of them, some of the ones you have raised today are already included there. Some others are perhaps not included, but let's see. But before we move forward, this is just a slide to show where social media is, or social intelligence, as we have called it here. Basically, if you remember from the sessions this morning, Stephanie Musialski also presented some of the main methods that we have nowadays to gather big data. So we would have what is online information. This is social media analysis, and for example, also bibliometric analysis, and text analytics is also here. It's not really to gather information, but it's a very useful tool to analyze it. And bibliometric analysis has really been used a lot in evaluations. I don't know if you have come across some of the studies that use analysis of citations, but it's really widely used already. We might not have thought that it's big data, but it actually is. Then in terms of Internet of Things, there is passive measurement and biometrics. This is basically the use of, for example, apps installed in your phones to gather data, or to gather data from your GPS, etc. Then there are physical sensors. This is basically satellite, and I think there was a workshop that was covering this element here. All this, and then we have crowdsourced data, which is basically surveys, but run in a different way than normally. So online surveys is already something that has been going on for the last years, but as Monsieur there was saying, people now are getting fed of, replying to surveys. So we are trying to figure out new ways to ask people questions. So, for example, something that we are testing at the moment in Ipsos is the use of bots and voice assistants like Alexa to carry out surveys. And just to go quickly, oh, this is not working. Okay. Just to go on the elements that we were just discussing, the opportunities, challenges, and limitations. This is a survey that we conducted a few years ago, asking people about their use of social media activity. So, as it has been raised already here, depending on the country where you are conducting your research, or depending on the population you are targeting, you might find social media analysis like a suitable tool or not. Like, for example, if you see, this is Japan. In Japan, the use of social media is really very limited. So perhaps if you are conducting an analysis there, it's not the right tool to use. But if you are conducting an analysis in Mexico, where social media is widely used, perhaps this is really a tool that you can use, no? So that is why we have phrased this as either an opportunity or a limitation, because it's something that you need to consider when you start thinking of the methodology that you are going to use. Then in terms of the characteristics that social media use, I think most of these elements have been raised by you already. It's because of its ubiquity, you can conduct field work. You can really explore sentiment of people from across the world, which is something that perhaps you would not be able to do with a survey because of the limitations on budget mainly. You can also reach hard to reach groups that would not answer to a survey, but who are actually active on social media. And you can also use social media as a way of carrying out kind of an exploratory analysis. So as you, for example, were saying, you could use it to explore what is the sentiment of people around something, and then use all these findings that you got to tailor your survey, for example, no? And then there are also, obviously, social media can be used in evaluations, but not in any evaluation, no? It's not something that can be just applied to any kind of research. From our experience, we've seen that it's, for example, a way to explore whether an intervention is reaching its target audiences online, if the population that it's been targeted more or less matches the population that uses social media. We have also seen that, well, nowadays, any kind of campaign, communications campaign will have a social media component, so it can actually be used to measure whether the intervention on social media is actually raising awareness on something, and it can also be used to measure whether an intervention is changing attitudes or behaviors, if these behaviors are supposed to happen online. And now my colleague Steve is going to talk about the challenges.
So yes, I think it's also worth saying that we're certainly not advocating using social media to replace surveys. The way we see it as researchers as a tool to potentially complement that data, and that will be important as a tool for triangulation. And I think one of the reasons why is because there are still lots of challenges and limitations, and it's just worth getting those out of the way a little bit, and we'll try and be a bit more positive as we go through the rest of the session. But for us, one of the challenges is actually ourselves. So as researchers and evaluators, and we talked a little bit about this morning, are we feeling able and confident and to consider using social media? We're often trying to judge it by the same metrics that we judge normal other kind of evaluation methods by in surveys, and apply the same tests of rigor. So we've got to step out of our comfort zones to see if we can use social media, and it's a sensible tool for application. Quality of the data. I think we've already talked about representativeness. That's one issue. Something else we'll hope to show today is that even if it's a useful tool, the way in which you design your query already kind of means that you can't capture all of the information you're after. You kind of you already bring biases to the table when you design social media research. So there's always going to be issues with quality despite our best efforts. And then there's a question of access. Lots of the tools that Raquel mentioned earlier in terms of different social media platforms, they're not all as readily available as others. So I think most are probably familiar that Twitter has a really useful API. Most of the other social media kind of networks and services don't give information away as freely. Facebook is a classic. It has its ability to access kind of private data. If you ask Facebook a particular question, it has services where you can say how many people have mentioned my brand, but you're otherwise only, as researchers, able to access the posts that are on publicly available pages. So again, we've got an issue of access. And then finally, ethical considerations. And for us and lots of our clients in the public sector, this has been a big barrier. Even if they're interested in doing it, they're cautious, quite rightly, about making sure that they're doing it for the right reasons, analysing and kind of harvesting the data in the right way, and making sure that they're protecting the rights and kind of anonymity of research participants as well. So ethical considerations, both in terms of getting approval and feeling confident in agreeing it with your colleagues and your lawyers, is also a barrier potentially for using social media. So we've put these down as challenges because we think there are things you can do to mitigate against them and reduce the challenge and kind of increase the opportunity. And hopefully that's something we'll try and see whether we've managed to do that by the end of the workshop. Cool. And then there's just some limitations to say, even if you do all those things to try and kind of improve the quality to the greatest possible extent, there are always going to be some limitations. That doesn't mean that it's not a useful tool, doesn't mean that it can't be triangulated with other data sources. It just means that you need to be aware of these when reporting and considering using social media analysis. So, as Raquel mentioned, it's not feasible to analyze, kind of assess outcomes and impacts, especially where they're offline. And not as good as some of the other tools that we're used to in that sense. And that's why triangulation is really important. There's often a time lapse and the ability to actually capture the information. Social media data is often only held for a certain period of time, so it's quite difficult to get kind of historical data. And so that's a challenge for us. As we said around quality of data, we can't overcome the issue of representativeness ourselves as researchers. So there's always going to be that issue around who it represents. And I think it's worth saying that there's kind of, is it representative of the whole population? And is it actually representative of the online population? So often in social media, we're counting the number of mentions, not the number of people. So that's a very different framework in which we're kind of used to working. So some challenges there too. And as we've mentioned, of course, not everyone uses social media. So as we said, I think we've actually captured most of those things we kind of pre-baked here on our tool over here. So I think, what do people think? Does our summary reflect what we discussed earlier? I think we came up with most of those. Has anyone got any additional kind of comments or thoughts around opportunities and barriers and limitations? Or was that a useful context in which to think about social media? I think just to maybe reflect myself, I think we were talking about representativeness. The personalities issue is a really good one that maybe we didn't add in around are people, and it's not to say that's any less true, because it may be that your offline personality is fake. In that sense, actually, you're able to be more honest and open than you otherwise might be when you're with your friends or your family. But there's definitely a difference between the kind of offline personality world and the offline personality world.
And I mean, for surveys, to some extent, it's a recognized social desirability bias that is always there. So I think it's fair to put on the table all the limitations, but I don't think that there are issues that are present in one but not in the other methods.
Yeah, that's not to say that the other methods are perfect either. Does that mean?
This idea of fakeness or...
Yeah.
And I think actually maybe to counteract that, on social media you can triangulate a lot of different activities to try to go to the real profile or whatever. So then if you have more observations around one thing, then you can
think that's a really good point. And some of these other challenges around the kind of cultural context and the multi-language, you often have that in, even if you're designing a survey that needs to reach across different countries. So cultural context is, yeah, nothing specific perhaps. We talked about representativeness. And yes, I think you definitely need to triangulate it with behavioral data, if that was something you were interested in, not just what people say. In terms of opportunities, though, we're going to discuss some of these actually. And there's a case study we've got very similar to quality of life, case study very similar to kind of reaching beneficiaries, another case study very similar in terms of kind of services and whether people are happy or dissatisfied with their service. So that's definitely all things that are already being used for social media in kind of evaluation and research. But I think that was just our kind of context piece. Yes. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. One of the things hopefully social media can do is help to understand those bubbles and the groups and the networks and the mapping that we're talking about. But yeah, we have to be wary of that in the analysis for sure. Someone else had a comment.
I don't know if you agree, and I don't know how to categorize that as a barrier or a limitation, but I think that this type of task that is trying to protect the person, I think GDPR, it's going to be one of these, either a barrier or a limitation. So in the end, I think it's going to be linked also a little bit the evaluation of the new methods that we want to apply or to figure out how to do it, especially.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. We've got that as a little workshop task for us all this afternoon, because I think our sense is that the ethics is kind of seen as a perceived barrier a little bit, as if some people are on one end of the spectrum and say, all this data is open, we shouldn't even have to care about ethics. Others take it as a very much kind of quite scared, I don't know how to navigate this very well. So what hopefully we'll get to is thinking about some methods of best practice. GDPR definitely allows you to do social media analysis and social intelligence, but it leaves quite a lot of room for the researcher to come up with the framework in which, whether it's appropriate or not, and whether it passes a number of different tests. So I think it'd be good to discuss those as well before the end of the session. Okay, we're probably about time to let you see some real examples, and at this point, I'll just hand over to Dr. Jun. Yeah, of course.
Okay, it's perfect. So, I think it's okay, so I said before, my background is computer science. Probably I'm the only one in this room as a computer scientist. But I'm very interested in research across different disciplines. So, okay. So that's why I see I'm from computer science. I'm on this side of the bridge. I want to build a bridge to different research area. So particularly, I'm also interested in social science, also interested in biology. I also try to build a new project with people from different areas. And this time, in particular, I'm talking about, so this does not work. Okay, so I just use the keyboard. So I'm talking about how to analyze Instagram data. So why do you have experience with Instagram? So if a user in Instagram, normally this is what you see yourself. You have a user, you have your name on Instagram. You also have a number of followers, and also the number of users actually are following you. And also you have the list of posts you made on Instagram. If you click one of the pictures, and probably you see this part of the slides, you see that this is the photo you make, and also there you can put your comments on it. So they said this bridge looks good, and also you can also put a so-called a hashtag to this picture. And below that, you see that many of your friends might also try to make their comments on the photos. And also, you can also receive a number of likes, how many people actually like this photo you post on Instagram. Okay. And the main reason for me to focus on Instagram, because there's more and more actually active users on Instagram. You see, Instagram started in the in the later October in 2010, and from that it attract and more users. So today, if you see at this time point, estimate there are about like 1 billion active users every month on Instagram. So that's why on Instagram actually you can get a lot of interesting data. So here there are more numbers about Instagram. For example, if you're talking about the daily active users, that's about like 500 million. And if you think about how many photos are shared on Instagram, so the number is about like 50 billion. And for me, it's also interesting to see that there are actually like 25 million of business are running on Instagram. I haven't looked inside what exactly the business is, but you see that people are actually doing things like this. And if you're talking about the users, so so you have to see that most of the Instagram users are actually females. Okay, so that makes sure that if you want to analyze this data, you have to take these kind of bias in mind. And also you see that actually also most of the users are actually teenagers. You see that almost 60% of internet users between the age 19 and 29 use Instagram, and 72% of the teenagers actually use Instagram. So you have to see that this is more or less for young people. And one of the reasons for me to look at this Instagram, because I want to look at the locations in Instagram. So that's one of the reasons is that posts with locations actually get more engagement. So if you put pictures with locations, normally you receive more likes and you get more comments from your friends. And we're also looking at hashtags on Instagram, and the most popular hashtags are love, Instagood, me cute, and follow. And pizza is most popular food on Instagram, and followed by sushi. So if you look close into Instagram, you can find all kinds of this kind of numbers or fact about Instagram. And for me, so like in 2016, with my students, actually, but at that time, this API of Instagram is still public, so you can get a lot of Instagram data through the public APIs. So what I have is I collect Instagram data from 2010 to 2016. So it's like more like 6 years of Instagram data. I collect data for like focus on several big cities. If you look at the US, I get the data from New York, San Francisco, and LA. I also get the data about London and Paris, and also about Tokyo. Essentially, what I'm focused on is the users, their social network, and also their behavior. In terms of behavior, I look at what kind of photos they published on Instagram. I also look at what the locations of the photos, and also collect all the hashtags associated with the photos. So if you look at New York, I have like 1 million users, and also I have all the social relations between the users. And you see that the number of photos is about 90 million, and the hashtag about 67 million. So not roughly, if you have one photo, you get like 3 to 4 hashtags to it. Okay, actually I get more information because I can collect the location of the photos and through another social network called Foursquare. I use the API of Foursquare to collect the information about the locations, their semantics. So I can check whether the location is a restaurant or it's a museum. And also I can get all the ranking and the likes linked to these locations. And in addition, I also get information about users on Instagram. So you see that this is really huge data set for me to analyze. Here I give you one. Yeah.
Just a question. You selected by your own the information that you wanted to cross, if I well understand, or you took the number of standard information, or you identify the number of information that you wanted to cross to obtain?
Actually, the data collection is more like that. If I look at one like post on Instagram, I focus on the post with the location data. So I then look at the users and try to get all his past behavior or his behavior on Instagram, and I also look at their social network, look at who follows this user and who are the followers, and then go through this social network. And that time I do this random sampling again, and then to get this kind of data. And for the location data, I said if I know the location IDs, and then I can go through another social network like a Foursquare APIs to get more information about this location.
How do you get this information that you collect? Which is the objective of this information?
Yeah, that's I'll show you later. Okay, so this is just like I plot the check-ins of the photos. I mean, check-ins for me is similar like photos on the New York data set. And you see that most of the check-ins actually concentrate on this Manhattan Island. Yeah, so it actually makes sense. And you see some part of the city that don't have so many check-ins. This is probably more interesting to the social science. You can raise a lot of like research about questions regarding who checking where. Okay. And for me, as I said at the beginning, I mainly focus on this kind of privacy issues. So what the research project I performed is that how to predict the social relations through the check-in data. So what I did is, so I look at the users, but I don't look at their social relations. So you see that side, I don't have the connection between users, but I simply look at the place they actually visited. Then, so this is probably more like a technical, because through the locations, and then you link to the other users. So I perform this so-called random walk through the user location graph. But I don't have, remember that I don't have the social relation between the users. Then I perform a number of random walks. Then I give these informations into like deep neural networks. Then I learn a kind of like representation of the location profiles of the users. So you get like vectors of continuous numbers to represent the mobility of the users. Then simply, I mean, we take that if you are actually where you go, then simply we look at the mobility profiles, then we check the similarity between two users. Then here we perform a so-called unsupervised learning because we don't know the social relation between users. We simply look at how similar they are in terms of mobility. If the similarity above a certain threshold, then we say they are actually friends. So it's a very simple task. So then this is the performance of our prediction. You see that. So you see this is our work. And our work, this kind of unsupervised learning actually outperform all the existing methods which actually perform machine learning. They look at the different features of your data and try to perform link prediction. But if you look at what we did, the method is actually performing really well. And we test our method on a number of cities, and the results are quite consistent. Okay. So this is the first project we have. The second project is we are going to do is, because we assume that the adversary simply look at like a photo or video you post on Instagram, but simply want to try to predict where the photo is taken. So we want to predict the location of the photo by simply look at the hashtags. So we get hashtags and want to know where the photo is taken. So what we did is we performed this so-called supervised learning. So for each locations, we know where for each locations, we know what are the hashtags associated to it. Then we simply use the hashtag as a feature representations of the location. Then we simply perform this so-called random forest machine learning. So, but in this case, it's multi-class classification because there are so many locations in the city. We perform this multi-class classification. So then you see what the result is. So the performance of this kind of algorithm is performed quite well. You see that the overall this accuracy is more or less about 69 or 70%. We also have two scenarios. In the first scenario is that the target user actually shared all his poster with hashtag and checkings on Instagram. And the second scenario is that the target user actually never shared his any location with the post. So the first case is that the user have not so much privacy protection in his mind, but for the second case is this user have a very like sensitive sense of his privacy. And if you look at the performance of the algorithm, actually they perform very well. And if you look at the baseline is like you perform like random guess. It gives you a photo, it performs like random guess where the photo is. And if you use our like machine learning algorithm, you see that the correctness is quite good. You get more or less, I mean, in most cases, your guess is correct. And of course, at this moment, you can think about how shall we protect our location privacy. To protect that, there are several techniques. What you can do is you simply, I said, sometimes you post make a photo on Instagram, you don't put the location into it. So this is called hiding. Sometimes it's you simply use a different location, use a different hashtags which associate with your photo. So let me say again, once you post pictures, normally you want to post, also give a number of hashtags. So sometimes you don't put the hashtag or you use a different hashtags. But of course, you want to preserve the utility in the sense that you want to have use hashtag in the similar semantics. So the hashtag more or less have the same meaning, but by doing this, and you see that in our performance, if the interesting case is that if you simply hide two hashtags or you replace two hashtags with the similar hashtags, then you can make our this kind of machine learning model, the performance of the machine learning model actually reduced quite a lot, mostly from like 60% to this only 20%. So the more interesting, the most important message I want to show that if you only like pay attention to like very few hashtags you want to put on the photo, this already have very good protection for your location privacy. Okay. And I think in the end, I think from in the morning you heard about this kind of doctor training unit. Actually, in this doctor training unit, I have another like project, continue on what I'm doing with Instagram data. In particular, for this project, it's aimed to develop a new method to look at how this kind of information are spread on this kind of online social medias. And also really interesting to look at the community structures in this kind of social medias and also try to identify users which are really like influential. So this is probably related to some of questions you have in mind, what kind of things you can do with social media and data set. I think that's all. If you have questions, I'm going to take. Yeah.
I hope it will be a relevant question. Why this type of, when analyzing this type of social media specifically, and is your job or expertise applicable to other, I guess it is possible to duplicate this type of analysis on other social media, depending
Yeah.
what are the
The first thing why.
motivation for this?
Okay. So the first thing is why I focus on Instagram data, because I'm very interested in this kind of location data, location privacy. As I said at the very beginning, users on Instagram are more like willing to expose their locations. So yeah, okay. But I think the analysis can also be applied to other social media data as well. Essentially, if in the end we achieve what we promise in the project, we analyze the like community structures, the social influence, we understand how information are spread over social media. I think probably Twitter and Instagram, they behave a little bit different, but I hope the method itself can be quite general.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In America, you have two
Europe, one,
like
yeah.
Japan and
Yeah.
Asia and everything. Is this somehow weighted, or it's just, let's say, you put all the information that you grab from these cities and then you have made this analysis? Because I'm asking this because it's completely different if sometimes you analyze it just Europe or just America, because it's different approaches, it's different cultural things. So I'm wondering about your
Yeah,
conclusions,
and
if it's
okay.
everything.
That's a very good question. For this particular study, we actually focus on the cities, and we know where the users actually locate, where the user actually lives, and we look at the users and get all the data about this user. So that's why I get the photos with the locations in each city. And to answer your question, I also have another data set which I didn't present here. Which I did is I random sampling like 10 million Instagram user. So because the Instagram user has this kind of user IDs, so I perform like random sample one user IDs, and I ask Instagram whether this is valid ID or not. If it tells me this is valid, and then I get try to get the data from this user. And for that, I have 10 million user data. But that, the thing is, I don't have social networks, so you cannot analyze how the information spread over the social network, how people connect to each other. But yeah.
Like, for example, you said that 69, 70% of the users, they are female.
Yeah.
So that's what I was wondering. It's much more normal that that would happen, for example, in America than it would be in Europe.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Then I have to look at, that would be interesting. I look at each of the data sets that I have and try to see actually whether the 70% of users are female, whether that's hold for Europe or for Asian cities as well. But that's a very interesting thing that you have to, once you perform this kind of studies, you have to make sure that you know what is bias in your data set. You have to be very careful. Okay, good. Yeah.
Two comments. You were mentioning you use the tags to locate.
Yeah, the hashtags.
That, and you said that with two general tags you can
Yeah.
mask
The location. Yeah.
But, in modern pictures you have geolocation.
Yeah.
So, and I guess many people are not aware about that, and
Yeah.
it's just in the picture itself. And
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good question. So that's okay.
Consider that as the best way to obfuscate their location.
Yeah. So that's a very good question. Can I try to answer first?
Yeah. Yes.
So that's what we have. So we take we use the geolocations of the photos, of the videos on Instagram as the ground truth. And our purpose is that some people are more aware of their location privacy. So in that case, when he published a photo on Instagram, he will not give the location of the data, of the photo. But simply look at the hashtag associated with the photo, we can get to know what exactly the photo is taken. Yeah. But again, if you have the geolocations, you can also protect by generalize this location. Instead of saying that I'm in this particular room, you say that I'm in Kitchener. But this already have a very good protection of your location privacy.
My second comment was, if I understand well, you use the physical location to deduct interactions of the relationship
Okay.
between people. I find it a bit paradoxal because thanks to all these social networks,
Yeah.
people can actually get in touch without being physically in the same place.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of
So that is not about, so that is where my method is different from existing methods. So most of the method published before, they simply look at the co-location of users, and from that infer their social relations. But from my work, we don't say that you have to be in the same place, but we simply look at the position, the locations you have been to. But that's, you don't need to be in the same location. Simply look at where you will visit. This simply means that users more or less with the same, like, I don't know, hobby or the same they're more likely they are going to be friends. Of course, our model also captures the scenario in case they are actually being to the same place. So that's part of the model, but we don't have to enforce that on our analysis or our method. Okay.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
In that case, we will just follow with the examples from Ipsos. So, the first, I'm gonna introduce 2 examples, and I just want to be clear from the beginning that these 2 examples are kind of the first evaluations that we've done using social media, so they've been kind of exploratory, you know, to see how social media can be actually being built into evaluations. Of course, feel free to make as many questions as you want, or even criticisms to the methodology that we've followed, etc. And the first example is the evaluation of the Global Education Monitoring Report. I don't know if you ever came across this report, but basically it's a report that monitors education in the world and monitors how countries progress on achieving Sustainable Development Goal 4. This is an evaluation that we conducted for UNESCO, and basically the main aim of the evaluation was to assess whether the report fulfilled its mandate of monitoring Sustainable Development Goal 4, but also it had a component of analyzing how well the report had been disseminated. And a big part of the dissemination strategy of the report was done on social media. It was obviously also disseminated through events, etc., but there were lots of efforts going on social media. So that is why we suggested a methodology that combined all these elements. So as you see, I mean, there were lots of sources of information, so it was not just social media. And in this case, we had 100 interviews spread across the world. We had also a survey to over 2,000 people. We had a bibliometric analysis to understand the impact of the report in academia. We also had typical literature review, and finally, what the social media analysis, no? What we did here, we used a platform called Crimson and another one called Synthesio. I will write them down later in the screen in case you want to explore about them a little bit more. Basically, we try to analyze the volume of the conversation on this report across 3 last years. We had to evaluate the 3 last publications. This is a report that is published more or less every 1.5 years or every 2 years. Our client, UNESCO in this case, was already monitoring how many followers they had on social media. This is this line, the dark blue line. But as you see, the fact of having more followers doesn't mean that there was more spread out of the message, no, of the report. Actually, this last edition, as you see, was kind of less commented on social media. So already having this timeline gave us some inputs for this kind of exploratory analysis, and we saw here that this edition had been less commented on social media, so we could explore on interviews why this was the case, whether it was a problem, because every edition touches on a different topic, so we could explore whether it was a problem of the thematic of the report that perhaps was less relevant to the audience, or whether it was something different. And we could also see that the strategy on social media was more or less, there were peaks of activity when the reports were published, which is something normal, and also there were peaks of activity when there were big events happening, which was kind of helping the report to be disseminated in social media. We also could analyze where these mentions on social media were happening, and we saw that most of them were in the global north countries, although the readership were most located in the global south. Here I have to say, the limitation of this is, again, that this is capturing only the location of those profiles that accept to share their location, so it's kind of limited in that way. Also, when I talk about social media, the platform that we used kind of brings together all the conversations happening, but most of them are on Twitter because it is the platform that is more open. There was some conversation on Facebook, some conversation going on blogs, online media, but 90% overall was on Twitter. Doesn't work. And we also, part of the evaluation was trying to do a bit of benchmark with other reports that also monitor education across the world. And in this case, we had a very good benchmark because there was a report published by the World Bank. Is the World Development Report that is published every year, and every year covers a different thematic. But just happened that the edition in 2017 was on education as well, and was published at the same time as the Global Education Monitoring Report. So that gave us a very good opportunity to compare two different reports. We actually expected that the global education, that the report published by the World Bank would have much more comments on social media because it's more widely known. But in this case, we found that they were more or less raising the same kind of interest on social media. So that gave us a good steer of how active the team at UNESCO were in communicating on social media. Sorry, I went too far. And just briefly to explain how we actually triangulated the data with other research tools. When it comes to interviews, as I said at the beginning, we used interviews to understand why the last edition of the report had been less commented on social media. And we actually found that the thing is the edition in 2016 had a topic that was much more broad, was not just on education, but kind of spread much more across other thematic areas, was more kind of bringing different subjects on the development goals, and therefore reached other communities. And actually social media helped reaching these other communities that were kind of out of the core of the audiences that the Global Education Monitoring Report was normally reaching. We also used the interviews to explore how it could be better disseminated in the Global South. And as I was saying, the interviews were, as well as the survey were also explored to benchmark, to do this benchmarking exercise of the Global Education Monitoring Report with not just the report by the World Bank, but also the reports. The survey also was used to validate findings on the outreach of the report to see how many people had actually accessed each edition, and also, most importantly, to understand which audiences were actually keep informed by using social media so that we could target our recommendations better. This is another example. In this case, we used a tool that is called Node Excel. I don't know if you ever came across it, but it's basically a tool. It's very simple to use. The license that you have to pay, it's actually very cheap. I think it's like 60 quid a year, something like this. And it's really, honestly, it's very, very easy. You just write down an account name of Twitter. This only explores Twitter, and it's perhaps one of its key messages. And it brings you this. It tells you how the network mapping looks like on Twitter. So in this case, we had a new agency which has one of its main activities is a communications campaign. And they wanted to understand how well the campaign was being communicated on social media and how their mapping of stakeholders looked like. So on top of the analysis of volumes of conversations that were happening online, which is the analysis I just presented, we also did this analysis on the stakeholder mapping, and we found that the agency was actually good at spreading the messages, but was actually never replying back. So just to explain what this map means. Each dot here represents an account on Twitter. This main dot here is our client, the European institution. This group here are the ones that are the closest in terms of followers or people who are having actual conversations online with our client. And then these are other users that are somehow also connected to our clients. And we saw that this is actually the typical structure of a network and some hubs. We saw that there are some accounts that are functioning as kind of centers and spreading the messages around their own circle. So as you see, we found that these were actually the main audiences. These were national institutes and other institutions very closely related to our client. Then there was this other group. Come on. Okay. There was this other group that were also very closely related, and this was a campaigner on social media. This other group, actually one of the centers was one person of the staff of the agency, and they were spreading the messages. And this other group was quite interesting because it's actually one of the main audiences that the agency was trying to reach. And we saw here that somehow they are not following the agency or they are not speaking to each other. However, they are speaking about the same issues online. So this tool doesn't just connect people who follow accounts or who speak to each other, but also people who share the same hashtags, for example, or speak about the same topics. So it brought together this group of users who, interestingly, were not directly connected to the main account, but who were receiving the messages as well. So just to summarize a little bit what we could actually deliver to our client, we were able with this information to help them improve a little bit their strategy, mainly on social media. We saw, main mentions were happening on Twitter, but as I say, this is more kind of a limitation of the tools that we are using that mainly capture these conversations. We could identify who were the most prolific the most prolific tweeters and authors, and we could identify who were the main centers of these mini hubs that we had. We could see, by having these key influencers, who perhaps you can try to, if our client posts something connecting those two people, it could generate more conversation, just by making these people talk to each other. And actually, it is a good way to improve your communications without really dedicating more resources. Because just with one tweet, you can generate much more conversation if you put in touch the right people. And we also could find out what people were talking about and which were the tools that were most commented on social media and the ones that people were finding more useful in their conversations. We also found with these two projects some strengths and limitations of using social media, and this comes back to perhaps the opportunities, strengths, barriers, etc. In terms of strengths, we just saw that to assess social media activity, just measuring the number of followers is not really telling you anything. You actually need to conduct some more research to know how well you are doing or not on social media. We used this analysis also to explore reactions of people and to actually then prompt for more questions on interviews and the survey. We could understand who was being better reached on social media and who was not so better reached. So for example, with this mapping of stakeholders, we saw that some people that the agency had made agreements with to speak on social media were not actually there. So even though some people were sharing messages, those were not actually reaching or generating much conversation afterwards. I think you had a question.
How do you know that someone, that a specific account holder on Twitter is a specific person or organization? Does Twitter give you that?
Yes. So here we've...
You are fully transparent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If it's an institution, I can understand. For a private person, I'm ready to support.
Yeah, exactly. So here we've hidden their accounts, but actually this gives us the exact account. So just by doing some, manual research of who these accounts are, you can see who they are. This actually is a very good point, and we will discuss about it later when we speak about ethics, because we couldn't give to our clients the full picture with all the accounts. We could only give the accounts that were belonging to organizations and not to individuals because of ethical issues. And just following with these trends, as I was saying, we could know who were the main influencers and who were the centers of activity so that the message could be better spread. In terms of limitations, it's not always suitable to measure outcomes. For example, the fact that people speak more about it on social media doesn't mean that they are actually, changing their behavior offline, let's say. Also, there is kind of an issue with the timeline to measure outcomes. You can have an intervention on a certain period of time, but then the moment in which you are analyzing it on social media. So for example, with Synthesio, which is the one we used to measure the volume of conversation, that only gives you 3 years of activity on social media. And the other one, the mapping of stakeholders, that is just a moment on time. So if your intervention was in 2010, there is no way you can get the mapping of stakeholders in 2010, you only get it now. So this is kind of a limitation as well. And this is more or less everything from my side. If you have more questions, I think we can better discuss it once you've seen all the different examples that we've brought.
That's great, thank you. So I think those two probably fall into the category of using social media to help understand whether beneficiaries have been reached as well. I'm going to show a couple of examples that are from the UK, so apologies, they're not particularly international, but all of these issues within the UK can definitely be applied elsewhere. They also come from our kind of research arm of the company, so these aren't particular they're not part of an evaluation, but again, hopefully you'll get a sense of how we're using it and how some of these opportunities can be applied elsewhere as well. So the first of those is something we're reporting soon, actually, for GambleAware. GambleAware is the main charity in the UK that basically kind of promotes responsible gambling. And one of the major concerns that's happening, and I'm sure it's not just the UK, is concern about kind of the impact of social media, and especially the immediacy of the marketing and the advertising in encouraging people to bet, potentially chase their losses, and the fact that they're just kind of one click away from placing a bet. So lots of the kind of literature out here has actually revealed quite a complex web, and it's not just traditional marketing brands. They have relationships with other people on social media that promote betting, called tipsters and affiliates. And so it was really important to help GambleAware understand kind of the extent to which this is a problem, what type of marketing and advertising is taking place on social media, the extent to which this is kind of relevant within the advertising codes that we have in the UK. Are people playing by the rules, or is there a kind of policy need for an intervention? And is there we've got regulators as well? Do they need to make a difference? So we're looking to assess the volume and tone and format of the ads, and the extent to which children and young people are part of that conversation on social media. So this very much kind of would fall into an exploratory piece of research if used for an evaluation. So that's why social media and social intelligence was particularly relevant to the project. How are we doing this? It's a particularly tricky project for us, actually. We're working with a think tank called Demos, who have a Centre for Analysis of Social Media, and the University of Sussex, who are our kind of data experts really, and computer scientists supporting us with this piece of work. So the collection was relatively straightforward in that it was identifying kind of gambling and marketing and advertising content. You could do that by looking at all the different brands and people who either have that in their kind of profiling information explicitly, or just by the language they're using, they're encouraging certain types of bets. They might have odds written in the kind of the content that they're sharing. Then we need to think about relevance. There's a whole load of other conversation that people are kind of sharing within that sphere. So it might be about kind of social responsibility. It might be about jobs. It might be other types of marketing. So we had to focus the conversation so it was just about gambling and betting and the advertising of it. I just wanted to focus slightly on the kind of the analysis that we're doing. It's going back to this idea of kind of humans and computers. This is really interesting in that we've got over here a machine learning strand, a natural language processing, which is helping essentially coders code up different bits of content and say, yes, I think that's theme A, that's theme B, that's theme C, and the machine learns with the human and tries to replicate those decisions of the sample that they're looking at across the whole data set. So the kind of a human might look at a couple of hundred, and the computer is able to replicate that across the whole data set. In particular interest, they were able to build something specifically on age. So looking at the extent to which people are mentioning their birthdays, or they might say how old they are in their profile. And this is a kind of pioneering piece of work done because we all know that Twitter has, you're allowed to be there from the age of 13 upwards. But there'll be a kind of portion of people who aren't actually 13 and who are lying about their age. So the team at the University of Sussex were able to help do some kind of classification on age to get a sense of the extent to which under 16s are part of this conversation. So that was really crucial to us. We also just did some simple keyword annotation, so if looking for key phrases such as there's a whole language around responsible gambling, be gamble aware, when the fun stops, that are used in the UK, and the extent to which those messages of responsible gambling are present in the marketing and advertising. And then we also took a really small subset, because there are some things that the machine can't do. Even with deep learning and AI, there are some bits of the kind of nuance and the context, particularly around the images that are used in the marketing gambling, that we actually just needed a team to sit through and code it manually using kind of human content analysis. So even though once we got through to the data, we actually had very different approaches going on simultaneously to answer some of our research questions. So that's just a quick a sense of where we're going with that project. Another one, this one picks up, I think, the example just around kind of commenting on everyday life. So the Greater London Authority is essentially the Mayor of London. So it's the kind of local organisation responsible for the governance of London in the UK. And the mayor there in kind of the summer last year set a challenge. He wanted to create a social evidence base and wanted to look beyond just traditional forms of kind of data. And he set up particularly a unit to look at kind of new and sustainable sources, including he wanted to explore the extent to which you can use consumer data, social media data, other forms of big data to try and kind of unpick issues that are quite difficult to do in surveys sometimes, potentially see if they spoke to new people who wouldn't take part in a survey, and also to kind of break down some of those definitions of measures. This one's around social integration, and the extent he wanted it to be quite bottom-up. So the idea here is using social media to get a sense of what are people talking about, and then trying to see if that relates to social integration, not a kind of top-down, kind of thematical approach that the team have decided is relevant or not to social integration. So this project is only a couple of weeks old, so it's really new. And just to tell you about the challenge, one of the challenges we've got at the minute is around just actually the collection. We didn't want to be defined top-down by your query has to include these types of words that we think are relevant to social integration. We wanted to try and get Londoners talking about London. And you think that sounds easy, but it's really, really tricky, actually. And we're trying to be kind of the least prescriptive that we can be. So we've got a huge database of all the different ways that people can be talking about London. And we also used some of the geolocated variables that are available to us on the social media tool and combining those together. So that's all the list of places, all the tube stops, all the postcodes, all of that kind of thing. And the idea then is that we're going to use topic modeling and some kind of human qualitative insight to get a sense of whether that conversation and the extent to which that's talking about social integration. So just, again, another flavor of a type of project where we're using that very, in a kind of exploratory sense to look at kind of how well integrated London is. And the third project is for a regulator in the UK. And in particular, just exactly to the point that was made at the back there earlier around kind of customer service and experience. Increasingly, people are turning to social media to try and get an immediate response directly from service providers. They're also using it just as a way to express their opinion about the service and the quality that they're getting. So we've actually done 2 different projects in this kind of realm. And the idea is to understand not only what are the different types of concerns and complaints that people are raising, but what's the difference in the quality of customer service that they get back from the service providers. So we're able to kind of, compare both the themes, compare both the providers, compare that over time, look at trends. That's the general aim of the project. Of course, social media is relevant for this because it's a phenomenon that's actually happening on social media. But the aim of the project is to triangulate that with, they also do surveys, they also do other research to look at the extent to which the different tools triangulate. And their hope is that social media will give them an immediate, rather than having to wait several weeks to do a piece of survey research, that they're able to get an immediate sense of how well customers are being served by looking at social media. And this is a more relatively straightforward project for us because we know the providers of the services. We're able to collect the information that's coming from their accounts. We're also easily able to identify conversation that's targeted at those providers. And so we're able to look at Facebook and Twitter, again, and look at providers and customers. One of the challenges for us was actually in the relevance here, because there's a lot of conversation about kind of the marketing of these. We weren't interested in the sales. Here's a particular offer to join our service. It was more those people that were talking about issues, about quality, about speed, about cost, about their account, whatever it might be. So there's quite a big piece in cleaning the data set that's a particular challenge. So those were just really quick 3 flavors, and so that's 6 examples, hopefully, that have given you some insight into the different way that social media is being used across kind of research and evaluation. And we thought, before we get you guys to do some work again, just any questions at all about the case studies? I don't personally. Worth saying. So I do have colleagues in other countries, but they tend to be more kind of US's, and Australia have done a lot of work in this area. We haven't. I don't think we've actually got any examples really of kind of inter-country continental experience of doing this, which is partly probably because of the client base, partly because of some of the challenges around getting different languages. There is a colleague who's done a study that includes it's kind of perceptions of different countries. So it's a country that's commissioned perceptions around the world. So he's managed to do it in Arabic, French, German, Spanish, English. But that's quite a focused, unique project. And again, that's more, that's not a kind of organization that's doing an intervention. They just want opinions of their country. So yes, no, we don't really yet.
Yes, indeed. So, as I said, that was kind of an exploratory analysis, but there may be many issues related to that. One of them is, for example, we translated the query into French and Spanish, but might be that people in the Global South were commenting on different languages and not using the hashtags, you know, that in English, let's say. Because what happens is that language is a barrier, but as well, people tend to use the hashtag in the original language. So even though, you know, we could collect posts in many different languages just because they were using the hashtag in English. Also, might be the case that they don't comment so much on social media, even though they are reading it. So there are lots of issues, and we explored that with the survey. I just don't remember right now the numbers, the figures on how much people said that they were, you know, from the Global South countries saying that they were becoming aware of new editions, etc., via social media. But this is something we can definitely look at. If you are interested, we can send you more information.
I think you're absolutely right. If you looked at the data in isolation, you could come to the wrong conclusion. So what you'd need to do is look at your kind of the audience, how many are on social media. I've seen some of the reports where their reports are based on how many people as a percentage of the users in that country. So a kind of penetration figure, which may be more useful in some circumstances, rather than comparing overall numbers, which might not be comparable. Okay, yes. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, I think that would be important to do. So one of the things we've suggested for that project is to do some further survey work to get a sense of the kind of comparison between those who are using social media to complain and those who might be using other avenues. I think you're right that it would be useful to have that context. I think what we've seen in the data is that the social media is providing a channel for people who can't get through other traditional means. So you've actually not responded to my email and I've still got this problem, or I've tried to contact your call center and they can't solve my problem. So it's, I think you're right, there's probably a bit of both going on, and it's difficult to know what we're not capturing, to not know what we don't know, if you see what I mean. But you're right, so I think if you took it at face value for what it is, and you were able to report on that, and then look at how that was changing over time, then I think that would be important. But you shouldn't try and claim it's something that it isn't. It's certainly not the overall picture of complaints on. Yeah. 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 I think that's definitely a risk. Cool. Okay. We have just the final question, perhaps. Before.
For the customer service experience, in terms of the analysis that you do, does it go into a binary kind of direction, like happy, unhappy, or do you have different categories or profiles?
Yeah, the latter of those. So everything can be tagged multiple times. So we've got one stream which is around sentiment, another stream which is around kind of the service issue, another stream that's around the consequence. So what they're saying is the impact of, of that. So yes, we've tried to take an approach that isn't mutually exclusive for the analysis, but you could do that if you wanted to. But we've got so many different themes to explore that would, and the data's quite rich in that sense. So you wouldn't want to put them just in one bucket. Yeah, and I think sentiment's notoriously difficult. So we've got kind of strength and positive and negative as best we can, but knowing that comes with lots of challenges around the computer trying to guess some of the nuance of that. So yeah, we're using it not as kind of in a robust sense, but just to give some qualitative color to what's happening. Cool, okay. We're a little bit short on time, but I think that's okay. So apologies if I run through the next bit. Can I just ask a question? We've got 2 activities, and we probably only have time for 1. Are people more interested in understanding the basics of how you might build a query, kind of theoretically, in terms of some of the things you have to think about when you want to draw down social media data? Or are you more interested in talking about the ethics and some of the best practice things we can put in place to not only get approval, but also as researchers, you know, what should we be doing ourselves? Just maybe a quick show of hands for the query, and a quick show of hands for ethics. Okay, sorry, query people. I'll run through that very quickly, just so you get a sense of what we're hoping to share. But then we'll do the task as the ethics discussion. So just a quick show of hands. How many people have tried to build a query on social media, like to draw down query? Okay, the people who are interested in the query building. Okay, I think this is helpful because even if you're interested in commissioning it or considering it in the future, even if you're not going to be the person who's technically responsible for building the query, there's a couple of things you need to know about kind of where the data comes from and the biases that you might be introducing even in that early stage of building your query. So we've had this conversation with a number of different clients who seem to think there is a kind of pure, clean sample that you can just get from social media. There's not, as such. There is in terms of some of the tools, and I think Dr. Jean had that in terms of you can collect a random sample of content, and that would be classed as the kind of the bucket here, the 100% random sample. The problem is that will have so much content that's not relevant to your query that there's really very little point in taking that approach. You have got to really, for you as a human and you as a machine to be looking at relevant content, give some indication of what you're looking for. So by and large, we tend to discount that approach. Sometimes you're interested in specific users, and again, you can often ask the APIs for data relating to specific users, but mostly you're interested in something called like Boolean logic, which is using these kind of rules. So you're writing a little piece of script that says and, or, not these words, or maybe these words near together, or you can use things like brackets that combine different words together. So if you've ever written a variable in SPSS, or anything like that, or a formula in Excel, it's very similar to that. So you need some kind of logic behind the query that you're telling the computer to draw down the data. So I was gonna, yes. And the other problem is that the data you're interested in is never a clean match with the kind of the instructions that you're giving it, but it's a really important consideration. So imagine your data that you're interested in looks a little bit like this bizarre blob shape here. It probably will do. One option is to take the whole sample. The problem here being is that you're not giving it any kind of direction and that you'll collect a whole lot of information kind of here on the outside of the dotted line that's just not relevant to your project, and you'll waste a lot of time trying to trawl through that data. You can give it some direction and maybe some keywords, things that you know are definitely relevant to your area of interest. The problem is that you're probably still going to get quite a lot of conversation that is not relevant to your topic of interest. So you can add a couple of extra layers, maybe some exclusions saying, oh, well, I'm not interested in this other relevant content. The problem is that you're probably going to exclude some of the content that you're interested in. So you may capture, it might be more accurate, but you've probably missed out on some of the things that are harder to define. And the fourth option is to go 100% pure gold. But the problem is so you're definitely, that the content that you're looking at is relevant, but you don't know what you've missed out on. So this is just, we've called this kind of an art rather than a science. And I think this is maybe a common misconception that it's easy to define the data that comes down. Even at this point, you're making a decision about whether you're taking an approach that's called low precision and high recall, or high precision and low recall. This means up here, which is the light green box, you're confident that you've included all possible permutations of your topic, which is called high recall. So of the conversation that's out there, how much is included in your sample, but that you're also capturing a lot of irrelevant content. You've got a lot of noise in your data set, which is low precision. How accurate is your data set? The flip side of that is that you've got high precision, everything in your data set is relevant and accurate, but you've missed out a lot of content. So I just wanted to pose that as a theoretical challenge, even right at the start of these projects, that you have to make a decision within the research team and the commissioner about which of these two approaches you're going to do, and you'll probably fall somewhere in between the two. So does everyone broadly have a concept of that? Okay, so I was going to ask you to actually have a go at building a query yourselves. And this is we do something called the Issues Index in the UK, which looks at what are the common issues that general public are thinking about right now. Unsurprisingly, the top one is Brexit, which is obviously a hot topic in the UK right now, with 63% of people saying it's the most important issue facing Britain. What we're trying to do actually is kind of compare, we do this in a face-to-face survey, compare online social media conversation at the same time, and just to see how comparable that is and how the trends align. So we've built a query that tries to capture all the conversation in the UK about the EU. So I was going to ask you guys to have a go at trying to build that. It looks like this, which might look a little bit scary if you haven't done it. So lots of ors, lots of names, lots of nears, lots of nots. But just actually, what I wanted to demonstrate that if you break your queries down, you think about them in the core components, it's not as scary. So if we break this down into its different bits, you might not be able to read all the names, but essentially in green, it's kind of all of these terms up here, EU, European Economic Area, are definitely things we want in our data set. In blue, we've got lots of conditions. So if you mention leave, or remain, and you mention some of these other people, Boris Johnson, Theresa May, Prime Minister, that probably is also content we're interested in. We've also got some kind of more broader terms around here. And near means if you mention one of these words within 1 or 2 or 3 words of the other one, then we also want that. So if they're in the same tweet. And for some reason, I'm not entirely sure why, we had to put this exclusion on at the bottom. So for some reason there was content about kind of sex coming up based on some of the words that we'd asked for. So you can say, I don't want it to include any of those terms in our content. So does that give you a sense of just some of the work you have to do to kind of build the query? And I think one thing that we do when we're starting to build a query is break it down into its composite parts. So this was for the customer experience example. So we looked at all the different ways in which people are talking about kind of concerns and complaints or praise, and had that in one bucket, and again built a query around that. We then said we want that as well as if you mention a particular brand. So that's the second box, is all the different ways, all the different people are talking about the brand. Sometimes that's really obvious, sometimes that's hard, depending on the name of the brand. So we wanted that content. What we didn't want is anyone talking about news or marketing. And there are some other kind of standard exclusions that we apply as well to try and make sure that it's relevant. So when you break it down into that kind of format, it doesn't seem as scary as what you end up with, which is something that looks like that. Okay. So we were then going to have a bit of fun and try and have a go at writing, get some feedback of how easy you found that. Not to mean that everyone has to be involved in the technical element, but I think it's important to understand the steps that you go through when drawing down social media data. So it's all possible. It just looks a little scary. Okay. So any questions on that before we move to ethics? No? Okay, how long have we got? 12 minutes. Okay. Right, so I mean, it's a theme of today, ethics, and I think we wanted to, it's an area of work that we've been particularly interested in. As researchers, we're used to having an ethical framework. We have codes of conduct. We have a market research society in the UK, ESMR, which is a kind of more global body. All tells us the ways in which we can interact with participants and how we gain consent, etc. We're interested in doing social media research, but no one is really telling us these are the rules of the game that you have to play. So we set a few years ago up about doing our own studies around kind of the guide to embedding ethics in social media. We talked to participants, we talked to kind of other stakeholders around what they wanted in this landscape. And we also did some work with government about kind of what putting people first and kind of a people-centered approach to ethical considerations about using data science in government. And I think the 3 bubbles that are worth thinking about, if you want to do a social media project, you need to think about the legal framework in your country. Am I going to be breaking the law by doing this? What do the regulations and my industry guidelines tell me I should and shouldn't be doing? But the problem is that there's a whole piece of work that they ignore, which is what do the public want and think. And what you don't want for a brand, for yourself, or for your client is to end up with a kind of Cambridge Analytica scandal, right? And this is where, the public perception is so important. And also, I think ethically, we want to make sure that we're kind of protecting users and doing things that they would want us to be doing. So we asked some questions around this as well to users. And just to show you that it was clear, we asked, to what extent do you have awareness that under terms and conditions when you sign up to using a social media account, these are the things that can happen to your data. Quite a lot of awareness. So this is, should happen, should it happen or not? And then the green bar is, do you think it's happening or not? So are they aware versus do they want it to happen? And you can see that they're generally aware, 57%, that the kind of social media data is used to get the ads that they want, but they're not particularly happy that this happens. They're less aware, or they were in 2015, that kind of even overall numbers of data can be used for research purposes, and even less aware that sharing of individual level data is used for research purposes. But we were really shocked to find that well over half of them don't think this should happen. There's a lot of concern for lots of different reasons why they think this is not fair for them. Wouldn't stop them from using the service, just to let you know. But they do think that it's not appropriate, lots of concerns. And I think even globally, this is a question we asked a few years ago, do you agree or disagree with this statement? I don't mind companies using information collected about me as long as it's anonymized and can't be linked back to me. So you'd think this is, we're doing all the things to protect people, but even still, there's a massive divide as to whether people are happy for this. Some differences in culture as well, and people have shifted in different directions between 2016 and 14. So I think it's not fair to say that users think privacy is dead. It's at the heart of a very important debate for them. And just to say that we asked the same question in 2018, and it's clear that people are now slightly more aware that some of these, the data is being shared for research purposes. But sorry, I know I'm rattling through these, but they're no more likely to think that it can happen. So I think things like Cambridge Analytica and the like have brought attention, but they're not any more accepting that this is the deal, this is the relationship. For me using the social media account, I'm happy for the data to be used in this way. So we think this is really important. We want to be on the side of the public in doing social media research. We also asked them to essentially imagine they were on an ethics board themselves and consider lots of different research projects. And we use a kind of statistical program to analyze which variables were most important when people were deciding whether or not to accept a different project. So I won't go, again, we're going to have a really fun game here, but we're running out of time. And just to show you that even best case scenario, we asked them on a score of 0 to 10, how likely would you be to approve this project? And the highest score was for researchers looking at public opinion, and they were inferring subgroups. Sorry, no, that's our least favorite. Where are we? So, sorry, our favorite one over here, researchers looking at public opinion, looking at public data that wasn't published, to explore health behaviors, something quite specific, and they were happy for subgroup analysis to take place. So this was our most kind of approved theoretical social media project. Still only 40% of people thought that they would be likely to approve that. All the way down, you can see the different permutations. If you've got private messages, even if you're a researcher, please don't look at my private messages, that goes down to 22. If you're a private company, I might be more willing for you to do that, actually, if you hold my data in a kind of reasonable and process it in the way I expect. So it's not all, there's no red lines, it's all very kind of intermingled and interlinked in terms of what people would find acceptable or not. So I just wanted to say that also it's worth saying that as a company, we've decided that you can't really claim that the social media data you collect won't include some personal identifiable data in it. I think despite your best efforts, even if you anonymize and take out the ID, it's such an unstructured data set that it's likely that people will mention a location, mention their name, maybe mention their address, maybe mention their ethnicity. The list could go on, and you can't control for all those things. But if you consider in the UK a legitimate interest, and you put some things in place, there's definitely the ethical framework that allows you to do this. So the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK gives you a kind of checklist of things you should consider when deciding whether or not to do, a legitimate interest, and they want to know whether you're doing it in line with the way in which individual users would expect. Will they find it intrusive? What are the safeguards? Have you got an opt-out? And how are you looking after children's data? And these are all things we can actually take positive action on as researchers. So if we had more time, we were just going to brainstorm some ideas of your experiences of getting ethical approval and what are the other steps that we can do. But we have 5 minutes. So any comments before I give you a head start and show you what we think you can do? Anyone got any ideas about what they've done on projects or what they would like to see to help make sure that it's as ethical and appropriate as possible? Everyone a little bit drowny after 2 hours, probably. So just to give you some of our ideas, and it'd be good to brainstorm if you think there are any more in addition to that, because we're always looking to develop as well. So I think one of the things we consider right at the start is the purpose of this project something that the public would find valuable, rather than is it just legally okay for us to be doing this? And I think that's a worthy question for all of us to be asking in terms of research and evaluation projects. Not necessarily an easy answer, but worth considering as well. We heard about the principle of data minimization this morning. For us, this means, and I think your point about what data did you collect when you were downloading the Instagram data, don't kind of just accept that you have to download all of the data that the platform gives you. Or sometimes you might have to technically, but you could delete the data very quickly as soon as you get it, or you could pseudo-anonymize it, we could anonymize it. So just think about actually the data that you need to collect, how it's stored, and only use the information that's relevant to your project. I think the other thing that's really important here at number 4 is consider what judgments and labels you're making with your kind of machine learning. So if you've got a study about hate crime, and you're labeling someone as someone who's made a hateful comment, or you're labeling someone as a racist, or you're labeling someone even maybe their gender, or you're making a comment around a certain opinion or an attitude they hold, just be really clear about whether that person would feel comfortable about you making that judgment. I think we know that the public don't like computers and kind of putting them into different boxes and assuming that they fit a certain profile. So they're really worried about us doing these things. It's not that it isn't helpful, but just be cautious about the labels and judgments you're using, especially what you're writing up in a report, I think, and the extent to which you're using comments to illustrate your points. And for us, we have decided we don't want anyone to be publicly kind of identifiable unless they're an organization or a really prominent individual, where the expectation would be that they're kind of, Theresa May, but it's fine to talk about and label in your report, but someone else, Joe Public, isn't. And I think a 6th one that we had is around children. It's a bit of an elephant in the room that everyone knows that children under 16 are on social media and in this data set. There's no way of kind of excluding them when you do ask for data. So what we've tried to do is just take a sensible approach. Do we expect this data set to contain lots of kind of children in it? Are we researching a topic that will have a larger kind of young person audience? And what else can we do to protect their anonymity and the way we analyze that? So we've just tried to take a case-by-case approach, but at least ask that question. Anyone got any comments on those or further ideas about how to go above and beyond the regulation and put other things in practice? Yes.
Just a comment on the first point. I also want to make it clear. I think it's very important because for me the whole discussion has been about protecting us as consumers of social media. We can also turn it around and see us as producers of data and information. And if you say, look, this is how we can empower you to learn and do things that are socially valuable, then it kind of changes the debate as long as we adhere to the rest. So I think it's important to educate people on the power of these methods, not just the protection.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. In the work I mentioned for the UK government, there are lots of positive case studies that they could think of about how social media data would be useful. And it often went also around to the redress. And even if they thought it was useful, kind of what other systems do you have in place that if you're making an operational decision to stop their benefits or something, they felt less comfortable. But if it was exploratory research, you know, at the aggregate level that would help make a decision, thumbs up. Yes.
The positive coverage is never at the same level of
No.
coverage.
You're right, that these examples are hidden away somewhere, and people are scared to talk about them in case they do get negative coverage, I think. Okay.
If there is no more question, maybe
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, what's your, as a professional, what Cambridge Analytica did wrong?
Where to start, I suppose. I mean, I think the first question is they probably didn't, I'm not sure if they ever sat down and thought about, it doesn't feel like they thought about, is this a good thing to be doing? What are the ethical implications of what we're doing? It sounds, you know, as an academic, they had links to academics, whether they went through an ethical process, I'm not sure, but we've decided to do that for all of our social media projects, and you get rebuttal at a really early stage about whether this is something that's valuable. And then the main second mistake seems to be that users just weren't in the loop about what was happening, and you know, there are lots of other mistakes, but those for me seem to be the main two things. You know, even if you did get ethical approval, you need participants to be on board, and they just were so far away from that it felt like, you know, that was the main thing that came back to bite. I don't know if you have a, I mean, that's just me speaking as me.
I'm asking as a daily person.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I comment on this? So I think ethically, they hide themselves behind academic research, where they are doing an intelligence service. Very straightforward, they have nothing to do with academic, and they use it for business.
So I think that's a good point. Being open. Some of the recommendations we made actually in that report about public ethics is being open and transparent about the work you're doing. So, and actually no one's doing this at the minute for fear of being lambasted, but saying these are the social media projects we're doing. Here's a site. You know, you can take it as far as even if you wanted to opt out, you can come and let us know. But no one's willing to go there yet. So I think as a kind of research and evaluation community, there are things we can do to improve the situation. But you're right, not being transparent about who you are and what you're doing is a big issue. Okay. Probably that's it. Thank you, everybody. Hope you found that session useful. We were going to ask just if, are you any more likely to consider using social media in evaluation and research? Just a show of hands if you're even slightly more open than you were at the start of the session. Okay. Maybe we haven't done a very good job. But hopefully what we've presented is at least some of the kind of challenges and considerations you should be thinking about, and demonstrated some examples of where you can do this in real life, and it's having a positive impact on kind of the insight community. Okay, thank you very much.